Today we're talking about aggression in chapter 10 from your social psych book. There are, oops, I always forget to do this. There we go. There are a couple different ways to think about aggression. Everyone's familiar with the instantaneous, spontaneous, emotional aggression. Someone pisses you off and you just get angry. And it comes out either words that you say but it's an immediate response to some sort of violation typically. Another type of aggression is considered to be perhaps a little bit more cold, and that is instrumental. That means you're using your aggression as an instrument to get something else. So if you're playing football and you tackle someone, the goal is not, you may have no feelings at all about that other player that you just tackled, but the goal is to win the game. And so even theft and some armed robberies can be considered instrumental aggression. Actually, if you read in your book chapter, your authors talk about that most terrorists think about their aggressive acts as being instrumental aggression. They're trying to get across a political agenda or idea. Also, there's physical aggression versus non-physical. Physical, obviously, you know what that looks like. It's punches, hits, kicks, slaps, trips, all sorts of things like that. The non-physical is going to be the verbal and social aggression. You can probably think of several examples of non-physical aggression. They include gossiping about someone. Even giving someone silent treatment is considered to be a form of non-physical aggression. Stealing one's boyfriend or girlfriend, flirting makes partner jealous, and bullying. Bullying is a big thing, especially online. And there's been some research on that. The kids who were victims of bullying were depressed more frequently, reported being lonely, and had higher anxiety. There's people who survive cyberbullying basically are more likely to smoke and drink and even consider suicide. I'm sure you're familiar with several famous cases like that. And even as recently as 10 years ago, about 54% of LGBTQ kids reported being cyberbullied. So there's a lot of aggression that goes on online, obviously. If you think about how aggression happens for us as human beings, I know I always go back to Phineas Gage because he was our case study where he had his frontal lobe knocked offline, and then they studied him as a case study and realized he had almost no control over his emotions. And so when you think about the filter we have for aggression, it's our frontal lobe. They also call the prefrontal cortex is the front of the frontal lobe. That is really what allows us to plan, moderate our emotions, make moral decisions. Then you also have the limbic brain. That's more considered the primitive animal part of the human. And this includes, if you remember the limbic system, the hippocampus, which is memory, but also a critical structure called the amygdala. And the amygdala is, again, one of our sensors for, is there a threat in our environment? But it also is the center for fear and rage. So the amygdala is a critical brain area when it comes to aggression. If you have any familiarity with antisocial personality disorder, that is usually a person who can treat other people like objects. And that means that they can kill, torture. People with antisocial personality disorder are more likely to end up in prison than any other personality disorder that we have. The research shows that the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex is a lot weaker for people with antisocial personality disorder. If you look at some of the chemicals that influence aggression, testosterone for one. Actually, even in little kids, boys are much more aggressive than girls at a young age. Testosterone in general, men are more aggressive, especially when it comes to unprovoked aggression. Now, when you're talking about provoked, someone actually comes at you and provokes you, then men and women equal out more often. Also, serotonin, you may remember this from intro psych. Serotonin is involved with depression, but also impulsivity. So a person who has low serotonin levels is much more likely to be very impulsive. And also that's associated with increased risk of self-harm too, so self-aggression and suicide. And alcohol, that's a huge factor. When you look at alcohol, I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later. It decreases the ability to use the prefrontal cortex, and interpret things appropriately. And it actually leads to expectations of aggression coming your way. If you look at more of the biology of aggression, we know through twin studies that identical twins are more similar in aggression than fraternal twins. Those twins who share 100% of their genes, they're much more alike in their aggression levels. Also, we know from breeding programs with animals, you can breed dogs and other animals to be hyper aggressive. And so we know genetically that the aggression is part of what's inherited in our genes. Culture is another factor, clearly. There's something called the culture of honor in the southern US. Basically, if someone is provoked, there's a higher expectation that, especially for white men, to like, you must defend your social status. You must, and even the study that's described in your book, and a lot of the studies that you see on aggression are done in this way. They will insult somebody or bump into somebody, and then later on give that person who's been angered or injured or basically even verbally assaulted an opportunity to shock that person who did it, or shock another person, or blast them with sound. That's, excuse me, typically how aggression studies are done in social psych. You can see there's a difference here in terms of northern students, because they did these studies in university campuses, versus southern students. The level of aggression that happens for southern white men when they are insulted or bumped into. They have a higher level of testosterone increase in response to that, and higher levels of aggressive behavior to someone else later on. Also culturally, I mean, clearly there are cultural factors in aggression when you look at homicides by firearms by country. This is how the US stacked up 3 years ago in comparison to other countries around the world. Obviously, we have different gun laws than other countries around the world, but it's a lethal factor that's available for people to act out their aggression. The question can be, are people in those other countries similarly aggressive, but they just don't have the means to kill someone? And that seems like quite a likelihood given the numbers you see here. Some situational factors in aggression. There's interesting area research. Heat, really hot days make people a lot more irritable. Also, though, it's a correlational factor. When it's hotter, people are more likely to be out and socializing. When it's freezing cold, people stay indoors and go to bed. But when it's hot in summertime, there's a lot more interactions, a lot more opportunities for people to get into arguments and to just really tick each other off. Also, you see road rage going up, especially in cars without air conditioning. More violence on the hot seasons, months, and days. Other variables include secondhand smoke, loud noises, crowding, pain is another one. There was another one I wanted to mention. Although we have the heat one. So these things are situational factors, which increase the likelihood someone will be aggressive later on. A study was done where, once again, you have the assistant of the researcher angers the participant in the study, and later on that participant has the opportunity to shock that assistant. The independent variable here was the true participant in the study seated in a room that had badminton rackets on a table, or an actual gun, a 12-gauge shotgun and a 38 caliber pistol were lying on the table. Now, when the person who was insulted has the opportunity to shock the person who insulted them, or think that the other person didn't really get shocked, but think that they're shocking that person. When the guns were there, you got a lot higher levels of aggression coming from those folks. It's interesting, the research shows that people who use guns as a means for hunting, you do not quite see this effect. They see guns in a different way as an instrument to engage in sport and hunting animals, but they don't have the same connection with aggression towards humans in follow-up studies. When you look at drugs and aggression, we know that alcohol increases aggression, but an interesting study was done where groups were given either high doses of alcohol or low doses of alcohol. Other groups were given high doses of marijuana or low doses of marijuana. All of them were angered in similar ways at separate times, and then given an opportunity to aggress towards the person who insulted them. You can probably guess who was the most aggressive and who was the least aggressive. The most aggressive were the people with high levels of alcohol. They were like laying on that buzzer and shocking the crap out of those people. People who had the most amount of weed didn't care. They were the least aggressive. So if you look at the consequences of these two different drugs, there's an effect on aggression. I put here, alcohol obviously impairs self-awareness. It leads to expectations of aggression. And also leads to misinterpretations of other people's interactions. So a person's like, what'd you say? And might think that it was like nasty or when it really wasn't. A lot of people say when you get mad, go home and beat a pillow, or you just need to get it out of your system and rage against something else. Doesn't work. Actually makes a person much more aggressive. Don't do it. That's all I have to say. I mean, actually, one of the recommendations your authors have at the end of the chapter is how can we decrease aggression? And it's like educate the population that catharsis does not work. Getting out of your system like that, raging against anything, just makes one angrier. So if you're a road rager too, don't let that stuff just go. Check yourself, because it just amps up your own aggressive tendencies. Sometimes this actually comes from a Freudian defense mechanism called displacement. If somebody angers us and we can't directly aggress against that person, we may end up taking out that aggression on another target that may be vulnerable and unable to strike back at us. That's called displacing. Instead of placing the aggression where it belongs, it's displacing it onto another target. And there's some research described in your book. I'm not going to go through every detail of the study, but I'd like you to pay attention to it, where there is evidence to show that displacement consistently happens. When you look at media, television, video games, Netflix, like all that stuff. Years, decades, like now over 40 years worth of research studies indicate there is a strong and significant correlation between exposure to aggressive shows and the likelihood for someone to be aggressive. Even when you control for all sorts of factors like education levels, income level, just also you control for others, you still see these very strong correlations. But also, aggressive people tend to prefer aggressive shows. Some things that happen with this, watching violent TV desensitizes a person to seeing violence. It just means less to a person. And it kind of changes a person's worldview too. So again, expecting to see aggression and violence everywhere. Well, I like this stat I found recently. If you think about it in terms of percentages, if 10 million people saw the same violent movie or show, if 1/10 of 1% of those people who watched that were primed to be more aggressive by that, and that's a very small percent, that's still 10,000 people. So, even if you think, oh, I'm not affected by that stuff, you may not be. But if 1/10 of 1% do get more affected by that, that's still a lot of people who then have an increased likelihood to be aggressive. Video games, I love video games myself, but there are clear associations with aggression. Some of the things that it does, again, it makes a person more desensitized, but only in video games are you allowed to basically learn a script and take a role and say, here's my job. And you learn how to be a sniper, or you learn how to go out and be aggressive towards others. That's why the military uses it to train soldiers on how to maneuver in combat. I mean, this is a common thing the US military is using now. We know that exposure to more aggressive video games leads to more aggressive thoughts, and it primes aggressive feelings too. If you take that numbers game again, say that it's like, okay, I'm not that affected by it. I mean, we have to look at the research and say, okay, odds are we probably are. But if someone is seriously affected by it, you go out by that 1/10 of 1% number again, a game sold, 10 million copies, you still got a lot of people going to be aggressive because of that. And the last area I wanted to mention was what your book talks about in terms of reducing aggression. They say actually one of the factors that could do that is reduce the income gap between the extremely wealthy and extremely poor. That situation breeds an arena for more aggressive and dissatisfaction. Educated about substance use and aggression, that alcohol is closely associated with more aggressive acts, obviously because of bar fights and stuff like that. Tell people catharsis doesn't work. Also, even training parents about punishment. I mean, punishment seems to really only be effective in a certain number of cases. And that's when, if you're going to punish, it has to be immediate and it has to be noticeable, strong, justified, and consistent. You can't be inconsistent, because then the kid's always going to look for ways to get away with, like, what are the conditions with which they can get away with something. Well, there's something else I was going to say about that. Also, if you use punishment, you have to, like, teach a child how to replace the unwanted behavior with the right behavior, with a good behavior. That's another piece of that. Consider, if your response as a parent is that I'm going to aggress against my kid, there's observational learning in there too. I mean, you're basically teaching your kids, this is how you handle problems physically. And so that's an issue too. Kids who end up being physically punished tend to have all sorts of issues that go on. Let's see, I had some notes down for myself. They have more aggression. They will typically do immediately what their parents say, but they'll have less control over their own aggression later on in life. If you can expose your kids to more helpful social skills training and apologizing and even training, I think they should have training programs in schools about empathy, training people how to empathize with a fellow classmate. And also going back to that attribution stuff, if you can teach people how to minimize their hostile attributions, that could help. If you know you're a road rager, stop and breathe. Don't amp it up, because if you cathart, you're going to be worse. And that could lead to car accidents too. That was our 17 minutes of the chapter on aggression. I hope that helped.